The funeral director called me aside. "We've buried 6 people from your apartment building this year." Nobody else seemed to notice the pattern. I was standing there in my black suit at Mrs. Kowalski's funeral, trying not to think about how she'd been my upstairs neighbor for only 3 months. Arthur Valdez, the funeral director, gestured for me to step away from the other mourners. His face looked strange, not the usual professional sympathy I'd seen from him twice before this year. "Can I speak with you privately?" Arthur whispered, glancing around the viewing room. We walked to his office behind the chapel, and he closed the door carefully. "Look, I don't know if this means anything, but you're from Riverside Gardens Apartments, right? Building C?" I nodded, confused why he was asking. Arthur opened a thick ledger on his desk and ran his finger down several pages of entries. "We've buried 6 people from your exact building since January. Mrs. Kowalski makes it 7. My stomach dropped. 7 people dead in one apartment building in 10 months? I lived in a 32-unit building, which meant nearly a quarter of my neighbors had died this year. Arthur kept talking, his voice getting quieter. The thing is, most of them were relatively young, healthy people in their 40s and 50s. Heart attacks, strokes, that sort of thing. But the frequency is what bothers me. He showed me the dates written in his careful handwriting. January 15th, March 2nd, April 18th, May 30th, July 12th, August 25th, and now October 8th. Has anyone else mentioned this pattern to you? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Arthur shook his head slowly. That's what's strange. Usually when there's a cluster of deaths like this, families start talking. Health department gets involved, but each family acts like their loss is isolated. Nobody connects the dots. He pulled out a manila folder and spread out several death certificates. Look at these addresses. Unit 3B, 5A, 2C, 4B, 6A, 1C, and now 3C. It's like someone's going floor by floor. I felt dizzy staring at those addresses. Mrs. Kowalski lived directly above me in 3C. The woman in 2C had died in April. I remembered the ambulance, but I'd been traveling for work and never learned details. Arthur, why are you telling me this? He leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. Because you live in 3A, and if this pattern continues, he didn't need to finish. I was surrounded by units where people had died. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the timeline Arthur had shown me. Deaths, roughly every 6 to 8 weeks since January. I started making a list of everyone I could remember seeing in the building hallways over the past year. Mrs. Kowalski had moved in around July. Mr. Singh from 5A had always seemed healthy when I passed him checking his mailbox. Janet from 2C used to walk her dog every morning until she didn't. I worked as a data analyst for an insurance company, which meant I knew how to recognize statistical anomalies. 7 deaths in a 32-unit building over 10 months was roughly 22% mortality rate, which was completely impossible for a general population. Even nursing homes didn't see death rates that high. I pulled up actuarial tables on my laptop and ran the numbers 3 different ways. The probability of this happening randomly was less than 0.001%. Something was definitely wrong. The next morning, I decided to talk to Diane, who lived in 4A and had been in the building longer than anyone. She was probably the closest thing we had to a building historian. I knocked on her door around 9 a.m., hoping I wouldn't seem too strange asking about dead neighbors. Diane invited me in and offered coffee, which I accepted because I needed the caffeine after lying awake all night. "Diane, I know this might sound weird, but have you noticed how many people in our building have died this year?" She set down her coffee cup harder than necessary and stared at me for a long moment. "You mean you've been paying attention too?" Her voice had an edge to it that surprised me. "I've been wondering if anyone else would notice. It's been eating at me for months." Diane walked to her kitchen drawer and pulled out a small notebook with dates written inside. "I started keeping track after Mr. Singh died because it felt like too much of a coincidence." She showed me her list, which matched Arthur's almost exactly. "The thing that bothers me most is how they all seemed fine until they weren't. Mrs. Kowalski was taking groceries up the stairs just last week. Janet was planning a vacation. These weren't people who seemed sick. We spent the next hour comparing notes about each person who'd died. Almost all of them had lived alone, which meant no one was monitoring their day-to-day health closely. Most had seemed isolated from the building community, keeping to themselves and not socializing much. There's something else," Diane said, lowering her voice even though we were alone. "I've noticed the same maintenance guy has been in the building more often this year, usually doing work in the units right before or after someone dies." My blood went cold. "What kind of work?" Diane shrugged. "HVAC repairs," he said. Something about upgrading the ventilation systems. "But I've lived here 8 years and we never needed that much maintenance before." She gave me a phone number written on a scrap of paper. "His name is Garrett Walsh. He works for the property management company. Always very polite, but there's something about him that makes me uncomfortable." That afternoon, I called the property management office and asked about recent maintenance in our building. The woman who answered seemed confused by my questions. "What ventilation upgrades? We haven't authorized any major HVAC work in Building C this year." She put me on hold and came back 5 minutes later. "I'm looking at our records, and we don't have any Garrett Walsh on our maintenance staff. We use Murphy & Sons for all HVAC work, and they haven't been to your building since 2019. I felt my hands start shaking as I hung up the phone. Someone had been posing as a maintenance worker and getting access to apartments right before people died. I immediately called Diane to tell her what I'd learned. Her voice was tight when she answered. I was hoping you'd call. I went down to the mailroom after you left and checked something. All 7 people who died had the same forwarding address on file with the Postal Service, an address that doesn't exist. But that wasn't even the worst part. Diane had also discovered that each victim had received a notice about mandatory apartment inspections exactly 2 weeks before they died. The notices looked official, with property management letterhead and everything. But when she called the office to ask about her own upcoming inspection, they had no record of sending any such notices. That evening, I drove to the library and used their computers to research Garrett Walsh. I found a LinkedIn profile for someone with that name who worked in commercial HVAC, but the photo didn't match Diane's description at all. The real Garrett Walsh was African American and in his 60s. The man Diane had been seeing was white and appeared to be in his 40s. 3 days later, everything changed when I noticed my own apartment door had been tampered with, tiny scratches around the lock that hadn't been there the day before. Someone had been picking my lock. I immediately called Diane, who said she'd found the same scratches on her door that morning. We both packed bags and decided to stay elsewhere until we could figure out what to do. We agreed to meet at the police station the next morning. I spent that night at my sister's place across town because I didn't feel safe in my own apartment. Every sound in the hallway had made me jump. I kept thinking about how my unit, 3A, was sandwiched between 2 apartments where people had died. If someone was targeting residents systematically, I was definitely in a vulnerable position. Detective Lisa Moreno listened to our entire story without interrupting, taking notes the whole time. When we finished, she was quiet for several minutes. "This is definitely suspicious enough to warrant an investigation," she said finally. "But I need you both to be very careful. If someone is deliberately causing these deaths, they know the building layout better than anyone. They'll notice if residents start asking questions or changing their routines." She arranged for increased patrol cars in our area and gave us her direct number. "Don't confront anyone you see doing maintenance work. Don't let anyone into your apartments claiming to be from management unless you verify their identity first. And if you notice anything unusual, call me immediately." Detective Moreno also promised to coordinate with the medical examiner's office to request more detailed autopsies on the recent deaths if the families consented. The next day, I decided to do some investigation of my own. I went to the building next door and knocked on apartments asking if anyone had seen unusual maintenance activity in our building. An elderly man named Victor, who lived on the 5th floor, said he'd been watching our building through his window for months because he was retired and bored. "Oh yes, that maintenance fellow," Victor said, settling into his recliner. "Very strange schedule. Always arrives on Sunday nights around 10 p.m. and works until about 2 a.m. Takes multiple trips carrying equipment up and down the stairs." Victor pulled out a pair of binoculars from his coffee table. I started writing down the times because it seemed odd. Maintenance workers usually come during business hours, don't they? Victor showed me a small calendar where he'd marked dates and times. Every single Sunday night for the past 10 months, he'd seen the fake maintenance man entering our building. He always parks in the visitor spot behind the building so you can't see his vehicle from the street, but I can see it from my bedroom window. Victor walked me to his bedroom and pointed out the window. "White van, no company markings, license plate starts with TGH, but I can't make out the rest." This was huge information. I thanked Victor and immediately called Detective Moreno to tell her what I'd learned. She said they'd set up surveillance for the following Sunday night. "If this pattern holds, we should be able to catch him in the act," she said. "But I still need you to stay away from your apartment until we resolve this." Friday afternoon, Detective Moreno called with news that made my stomach turn. The medical examiner had found traces of an unusual chemical compound in Mrs. Kowalski's blood work. It was a substance called succinylcholine that could cause cardiac arrest, but would metabolize quickly, making it almost impossible to detect unless you knew exactly what to look for. "We're exhuming the other bodies for testing," she told me, "and we've put a surveillance team in your building. Succinylcholine is used in hospitals during surgery to paralyze muscles temporarily, but in larger doses, it stops the heart. Someone with medical knowledge was using it to murder people in a way that looked like natural cardiac events. The chemical breaks down so quickly that it would never be detected in a standard autopsy unless specifically tested for within hours of death." Saturday night, I couldn't sleep, knowing that tomorrow might be the night we caught whoever had been killing my neighbors. Detective Moreno called around 8 p.m. to confirm the surveillance team was in position and reminded me to stay away from the area. "We've got unmarked cars on all sides of the building and officers stationed in vacant apartments on different floors. If he shows up, we'll get him." Sunday night felt like the longest night of my life. I sat at my sister's kitchen table staring at my phone, waiting for news. At 11:30 p.m., my phone finally rang. Detective Moreno's voice was tense when she answered. "We've got him. White male, approximately 45 years old, driving a white van with stolen plates. He had enough succinylcholine in his possession to kill dozens of people, but the revelation that shocked everyone was his identity. The man wasn't named Garrett Walsh at all. His real name was Patrick Henley, and he was a disgraced former paramedic who'd been fired from 3 different ambulance companies for stealing medications. He'd been working for an insurance fraud ring that targeted isolated residents with small life insurance policies. The investigation revealed that Patrick had been using obituaries to identify people who lived alone, then researching their living situations to find the most vulnerable targets. He'd been posing as a maintenance worker to gain access to apartments, where he'd plant hidden cameras to monitor residents' routines and identify the best times to strike. The fake forwarding addresses ensured that insurance payouts went to accomplices, instead of legitimate beneficiaries. The operation had been running for over 3 years across multiple apartment complexes in the city, with at least 47 confirmed victims. Our building had been specifically chosen because it housed many elderly and isolated residents who wouldn't be closely monitored by family members. Patrick had been systematically working through units, using stolen master keys to gain access for reconnaissance, then returning on Sunday nights when the building was quietest to administer lethal injections. The succinylcholine was administered through IV needles inserted while victims slept, causing them to go into cardiac arrest within minutes. During questioning, Patrick revealed that he'd been planning to kill me and Diane within the next 2 weeks because he'd noticed us asking questions about the deaths. He'd been monitoring our apartments with hidden cameras and knew we were getting suspicious. The scratches on our locks were from him installing surveillance equipment to track our movements. 2 weeks later, Detective Moreno called to tell me they'd arrested 6 other members of the insurance fraud ring, including 2 corrupt insurance agents who'd been processing the fake claims. The operation had been stealing millions of dollars by murdering vulnerable people and collecting life insurance payouts through fraudulent beneficiary changes. The investigation revealed that Patrick had been using a different identity at each apartment complex, always posing as various types of maintenance workers or contractors. He'd perfected a system where he would spend months studying residents' routines before making his move, which is why the deaths appeared to happen randomly rather than in obvious patterns. 3 months later, our building implemented comprehensive security measures, including mandatory background checks for all service workers, 24-hour security cameras in all common areas, and a requirement that residents verify all maintenance appointments directly with the management office. Arthur Valdez received a commendation from the police department for his observation skills and willingness to speak up when he noticed the unusual pattern of deaths. The insurance fraud ring had been operating across 7 different cities, with Patrick serving as their primary eliminator, while other members handled the paperwork and financial aspects. In total, they'd stolen over $2.8 million in fraudulent insurance payouts and were responsible for at least 63 deaths over a 4-year period. Patrick Henley was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole after pleading guilty to 47 counts of first-degree murder. The other members of the ring received sentences ranging from 25 years to life, depending on their level of involvement in the murders versus the financial fraud aspects. The case led to major reforms in how insurance companies process beneficiary changes and death claims, including mandatory waiting periods for new policies and enhanced verification procedures for life insurance payouts. Several apartment complexes across the city upgraded their security systems after learning how easily Patrick had gained access to buildings by impersonating maintenance workers. 6 months later, I moved to a different apartment complex with better security, but I kept in touch with Diane, who became one of my closest friends through this entire ordeal. We both testified at Patrick's trial and spoke at several community meetings about recognizing the warning signs of potential fraud targeting vulnerable residents. Arthur Valdez and I still email occasionally, and he tells me that his experience with our case has made him much more vigilant about unusual patterns in his business. He's reported 2 other potential clusters of suspicious deaths to authorities since then, though thankfully neither turned out to be criminal activity. The most important lesson I learned was to trust statistical intuition when something seems wrong, even if other people aren't noticing the pattern. If Arthur hadn't been keeping detailed records, and if Diane and I hadn't compared our observations, Patrick would have continued killing people indefinitely. Sometimes being the person who speaks up about uncomfortable patterns can literally save lives.